When I first met Anna, I was captivated. She was beautiful, brilliant, and brimming with passion, qualities that stood out even in a sea of people. She was in her final year of university, studying to become a high school teacher. I was already establishing myself in the business world, living life on my terms. We seemed like a perfect match. Her idealism balanced my pragmatism. Fast forward 5 years. I'm 32. She's 29, and our lives look flawless on paper. I run a successful logistics company, and Anna is a respected English teacher at a local high school. We live in a beautiful house in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence. I thought I was the husband every woman wanted, a provider who ensured that my wife wanted for nothing. Jewelry, designer handbags, spontaneous weekend getaways. I gave her everything. Everything, that is, except my time. I didn't see it at first. How the demands of work slowly pushed Anna into the background of my life. We still shared our bed, but the connection between us had grown quiet, muted under the weight of my packed schedules and late-night calls. I convinced myself she understood. After all, my hard work was for us, wasn't it? Anna's unhappiness first showed in subtle ways. Her voice, laced with disappointment when I canceled a date night. The way she stopped waiting up for me when I worked late. The moments she seemed lost in thought, staring out the window, distant. I chalked it up to stress from her job. Teaching wasn't easy, and teenagers weren't known for being angels. But then, small things began to nag at me. She started wearing makeup more often, even when she wasn't leaving the house. She dressed a little sharper for school than she used to, trading her usual cardigans for fitted blouses. And her phone, it was always in her hand, her thumb moving furiously across the screen. When I asked, she'd say it was just school stuff, emails, lesson planning, or messages from colleagues. I wanted to believe her, so I did. It wasn't until one Friday night, a night I decided to surprise her with dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant, that the first real crack appeared. She'd said she was staying late for curriculum meetings. Yet when I drove past the school on my way home to pick her up, the parking lot was empty, save for her car, and a beat-up Honda Civic I didn't recognize. I parked at a distance and sat there for 20 agonizing minutes, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. The lights in her classroom were still on, but the blinds were drawn. I stared at the Civic, trying to place it. A fellow teacher, maybe? But why would they meet here, after hours, when she'd said it was a group meeting? I don't know what stopped me from going inside that night. Maybe I wasn't ready to face what I feared. Maybe I was holding on to the hope that I was just being paranoid. Whatever the reason, I drove off, ignoring the sick feeling in my gut. That night, Anna came home around 9 p.m. She smelled faintly of sweat and perfume, and there was a lightness in her step that I hadn't seen in months. When I asked her how the meeting went, she smiled and said, "Exhausting. Same old, same old." I didn't press further, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion growing inside me. Something wasn't right. It would take another month before the truth started to unravel, and when it did, it wouldn't just destroy our marriage. It would explode in ways I could never have imagined. The affair, the lies, the fallout. It was just beginning, and I had no idea what was coming. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of her car parked next to that beat-up Civic. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious I became. Anna wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with anymore. She was distant, guarded, and her every action felt rehearsed, like she was tiptoeing around an invisible line. Her late nights grew more frequent, always accompanied by vague excuses about grading or helping struggling students. She'd come home with a glow, not the kind of glow from hard work, but the kind of glow that screams something is off. Her phone, which she once left carelessly on counters and tables, now seemed glued to her side. She had become an expert in keeping it just out of sight, slipping it into her pocket when I entered a room. I began to watch her more closely, silently cataloging her changes. There was the perfume I hadn't smelled in years suddenly reappearing, her wardrobe choices getting bolder, and her reluctance to answer simple questions about her day. She'd say things like, "You wouldn't understand, it's teacher stuff," waving off my curiosity. Then there were her absences, random errands that popped up out of nowhere, long stretches of time unaccounted for. My brain screamed at me to connect the dots, but I held back, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Anna was my wife, my Anna. She wouldn't betray me, right? But doubt has a way of eating away at you. It starts small, like a splinter you barely notice. Then it burrows deeper, festering, growing impossible to ignore. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to test her excuses. She had told me she was running out to pick up supplies for a class project. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice, but this time, I quietly followed her, keeping a safe distance. She didn't go to the store. Instead, she drove to a park on the other side of town and parked near a secluded trail. I stayed in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. 10 minutes later, a young man walked up to her car and got inside. I didn't need to see his face to know he was barely out of high school. His lanky frame and awkward movements gave him away. I didn't approach them. I couldn't. I sat there, frozen, as the car idled for what felt like an eternity. When he finally left and Anna drove away, I was still rooted to the spot, trying to process what I had just seen. A million questions ran through my mind, each one more devastating than the last. How long had this been going on? Who was this kid? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to think, to plan. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something far worse. I knew that if I exposed her, the fallout would be massive. Her career, her reputation, everything would be on the line. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she didn't care about the risks. She had already thrown away everything we'd built together for a moment of excitement with some teenager. And if she didn't care, why the hell should I? This wasn't going to end quietly. For a while, life fell back into a rhythm that almost felt normal. Anna's erratic behavior seemed to level out. Her late nights became less frequent, and the tension that had hung over our home like a storm cloud began to dissipate. I convinced myself that my suspicions were just that, wild fantasies born of overthinking and the pressures of work. Anna even seemed more affectionate, slipping her hand into mine during quiet evenings or surprising me with little gestures like my favorite coffee on particularly stressful mornings. She assured me her long hours had been for an ambitious student project, and I wanted so badly to believe her that I did. It felt good to breathe again, to let my guard down, but peace doesn't last forever. And sometimes the truth doesn't hide. It waits for the right moment to slap you across the face. It was a casual Saturday night when everything came crashing down. Susan and Mark Carter, our longtime friends and Brandon's parents, had invited us over for a small dinner party. Nothing fancy, just a few drinks, some laughs, and a chance to catch up. I almost said no, but Anna insisted. She was eager to see Susan and Mark again, and her enthusiasm felt genuine. When we arrived, the Carters greeted us warmly. Their home had always been inviting, with its cozy furniture and the faint scent of cinnamon candles. Brandon was there too, lounging in the living room with a book, barely glancing up when we walked in. Dinner was pleasant, full of stories and shared laughter. Anna was her usual charming self, engaging Susan with tales from school and laughing at Mark's terrible dad jokes. For a few hours, I allowed myself to relax, to forget the nagging feeling that had haunted me for weeks. But then, fate decided to intervene. After dinner, we moved to the living room for drinks. As Susan poured wine, I wandered around, admiring the little knickknacks and framed photos scattered across their shelves. That's when I saw it, something small and shiny sitting on the coffee table. At first, I thought it was a simple piece of costume jewelry, but as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was a ring, her ring, a custom-made gold band with a delicate engraving of our wedding date, something I had crafted for Anna on our first anniversary. She had mentioned losing it 2 weeks ago, claiming it must have slipped off her finger while gardening. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. People lose things. It happens. But here it was, unmistakably hers, sitting in the middle of the Carters' living room. I picked it up, the cool metal burning against my skin as questions flooded my mind. How did it get here? Why hadn't anyone mentioned finding it? I turned to Anna, holding the ring between my fingers like a damning piece of evidence. Anna, I said, keeping my voice steady, isn't this your ring? Her laughter died mid-sentence. She turned, her eyes widening as they locked onto the ring. For a moment, She looked frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. Then came the stammering. What? Oh, yes it is. I thought I lost that weeks ago, she said, her voice unnaturally high-pitched. Where did you find it? Right here, I said slowly, glancing at Susan. On the coffee table. Susan, did you find this recently? Susan looked puzzled, glancing at Mark, who shrugged. I didn't put it there, she said. Brandon must have found it. He's always picking up little things around the house. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the air suddenly thick with tension. Anna's hands fidgeted in her lap, her smile brittle as she tried to change the subject. But I wasn't letting it go. Brandon, I called, turning toward the kitchen where he was grabbing a snack. Do you remember where you found this? Brandon stepped into the room, his expression cautious as he glanced between Anna and me. He said hesitantly. It was in my car. I thought maybe Mom dropped it there when I drove her to the store, so I brought it inside. My heart stopped. My vision narrowed. Anna's face drained of color. She didn't even try to mask her panic now, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as though it could anchor her in the storm. The silence stretched unbearably, and I could feel Susan and Mark's eyes darting between us, trying to piece together the growing tension. But I already knew. That ring hadn't slipped off her finger while gardening. She hadn't lost it at home. She'd lost it in his car, Brandon's car. And suddenly, the fantasies I convinced myself were paranoia became cold, undeniable reality. I didn't confront her then and there. The Carters didn't deserve the spectacle. But as we drove home in icy silence, her hands trembling on her lap, I knew the time for answers was near. This wasn't just infidelity anymore. This was betrayal on a level that would shatter not just our marriage, but everything around us. She hadn't just destroyed us. She'd brought our friends, their family, and even their son into the fallout. And I was about to make sure everyone felt the impact. The car ride home was suffocating. Anna stared out the window, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She was usually the first to fill the silence. But tonight, the tension sat heavy between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard I could feel the leather biting into my palms. I didn't speak. Not yet. I wanted her to stew in her panic, to feel the walls closing in. I had all the time in the world, and her silence told me she knew it was over. That night after we got home, Anna went straight to the bedroom. She mumbled something about being tired and shut the door behind her. I stayed in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of bourbon and sitting at the table, replaying the night in my mind. The ring. Her damn ring. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything I thought we had, a piece of our shared history. Seeing it in Brandon's home, knowing she had lied so effortlessly about losing it, made my stomach churn. It wasn't the kind of mistake you could brush off as coincidence. It was evidence, plain and simple. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at Anna, but at myself. How had I been so blind, so willing to believe her excuses, to dismiss the signs that had been there all along? I finished the bourbon in one long gulp, the liquid burning as it went down. I had to act, but it had to be calculated. The next morning, I left for work early, but not before planting the seeds of doubt. Over breakfast, I casually placed the ring on the counter between us, turning it slowly with my fingers. Anna froze mid-bite, her eyes flicking between the ring and my face. You should take better care of this, I said, my tone neutral but my gaze sharp. She swallowed hard. Yeah, thanks, she said, reaching for it. Her hand shook ever so slightly as she slipped it back onto her finger, her smile forced. I'll make sure it doesn't get lost again. I didn't respond, just gave her a lingering look before grabbing my keys and heading out. But I wasn't going to work. Not today. My first stop was the Carter household. I knew it was risky, showing up unannounced so soon after the party, but I had to know more. Susan answered the door, looking surprised but pleased to see me. Ryan, is everything okay? I was just in the area, I lied, forcing a smile. Thought I'd swing by, and thank you again for dinner last night. It was lovely. Susan beamed. Of course. Cool mean. Can I get you some coffee? I accepted, making polite small talk as she poured us both a cup. After a few minutes, I steered the conversation toward Brandon. He seems to be doing well, I said casually, stirring sugar into my coffee. Busy with school? Susan sighed, shaking her head. Oh, you know how teenagers are. Always on the go. Always distracted. I just wish he'd focus a little more. He's been spending so much time on these side projects lately. Drives me crazy. Side projects? I asked, my interest piqued. Just odd errands, late-night drives, that sort of thing, she said, waving it off. I keep telling him he needs to set better priorities, but he says he's helping someone out. A teacher, I think? He's always been such a people-pleaser. My heart sank. My suspicions were no longer just suspicions. They were a full-blown certainty. Helping a teacher, huh? I said, keeping my tone light. Do you know who? Susan frowned, tapping her chin. I don't remember the name, but he mentioned it once. Anna something? Could that be your Anna? My hand tightened around my coffee cup. Maybe, I said carefully. I'll ask her about it. She probably forgot to mention it. By the time I left the Carter's house, my mind was racing. The pieces were all falling into place, painting a picture I couldn't ignore. Anna's sudden late nights, her lost ring, Brandon's mysterious errands. All of it pointed to one devastating truth. I couldn't confront her yet. Not here, not now. I needed her to feel the weight of what she'd done, not just in private, but in the eyes of those we both cared about. This wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about ensuring the world saw the true cost of her betrayal. And when the moment came, I knew exactly how to make it unforgettable. I spent the next few days orchestrating a plan that would make Anna's betrayal undeniable. Quietly, methodically, I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find. Her erratic schedule, the excuses, the ring, and now the revelation from Susan about Brandon's errands. Each piece painted a picture she could no longer deny. But more than that, I wanted the fallout to be public, to expose her duplicity in a way she couldn't escape. Anna, oblivious to the storm brewing, carried on as though everything was normal. She even started planning another dinner with the Carters, eager to keep up appearances. She had no idea this dinner would be the moment her web of lies unraveled. That Saturday night, Anna prepared meticulously. She wore her favorite dress, the one I'd always complimented, and even pulled out a bottle of expensive wine for the occasion. I watched her, silent, as she hummed to herself, entirely unaware of the ticking clock I'd set in motion. When we arrived at the Carter's house, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, as always. Susan and Mark greeted us with hugs, and Brandon nodded politely from the living room. Dinner was a lively affair, filled with laughter and stories that felt painfully out of place considering what I knew. As dessert was served, I casually steered the conversation toward Anna's work. Anna's been working so hard lately, I said, smiling at her across the table. All those late nights and extra projects. You must have some very dedicated students. Anna blinked, caught off guard by the sudden attention. Oh, well, you know, she said with a nervous laugh. The kids keep me busy, especially Brandon, right? I added, my tone light but pointed. The room fell silent. Anna froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Susan and Mark exchanged confused glances, while Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What do you mean? Susan asked, her brow furrowing. Oh, just that Anna mentioned Brandon's been helping her a lot lately, I said, my gaze locked on Anna. She's so lucky to have such a supportive student. Anna's face went pale, her eyes darting to Brandon, who looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. Ryan, I don't think this is... Anna began, her voice shaky. But I didn't let her finish. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ring, holding it up for everyone to see. This is Anna's ring, I said, my voice steady but sharp. The one she told me she lost. Brandon found it in his car and thought it belonged to his mother. Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he turned to his son. Brandon, is this true? Brandon stammered, his face red. I found it, but I didn't. And Anna, I continued, cutting him off. Why would your wedding ring be in a student's car? Care to explain? The silence was deafening. Anna's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her face a mask of panic and shame. Ryan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, let's talk about this later. No, I snapped, slamming the ring onto the table. We're talking about it now. In front of the people you've betrayed. Just like you betrayed me. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the implication sank in. Anna, she said, her voice shaking. Are you saying you and Brandon? Anna burst into tears, her face crumpling as the reality of her actions came crashing down. It wasn't like that, she sobbed. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't a mistake, I said coldly. A mistake doesn't end with your wedding ring in his car. Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He turned to Brandon, his voice like steel. Get to your room, now! Brandon hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, now! Mark roared, his fury unmistakable. Brandon bolted, disappearing down the hall as Anna continued to cry, her hands covering her face. Susan sat frozen, her expression a mix of shock and disgust. I stood, pushing my chair back calmly. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, I said to the Carters. But you deserve to know the truth. Then I turned to Anna, her tear-streaked face etched with desperation. We're done, I said, my voice cold. You destroyed everything. Now, you can live with the consequences. I left the house without looking back, the sound of Anna's sobs echoing in my ears. As I stepped into the night, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and the weight of her lies was no longer mine to carry. Now, it was hers, and she could choke on it. You know that moment when everything clicks into place, but instead of feeling relief, it's like your entire body is plunged into ice water? That was me, standing in the Carters' living room, holding Anna's wedding ring. The same ring she claimed had been lost 2 weeks ago. The same ring Susan had casually mentioned finding in Brandon's car. Brandon, her student, their son. But let me back up a second. The night had started innocently enough. Susan and Mark had invited us over for dinner, one of those cozy get-togethers where everyone drinks too much wine and swaps old stories. We'd been friends with them for years, and up until recently, I genuinely enjoyed their company. Even Brandon, their awkward but well-mannered son, was someone I'd always thought had a good head on his shoulders. And yet, there I was, gripping my wife's ring in one hand while the room spiraled into chaos around me. The first bomb dropped when I casually brought up Anna's late nights. Must be a lot of work, being a teacher, I'd said, swirling my wine like I wasn't seconds away from blowing up her life. Especially with all that extra time you've been putting in. You're lucky to have students like Brandon to help out. Anna froze. I saw the blood drain from her face before she plastered on this wobbly smile. I don't know what you're talking about, Ryan, she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. But Susan, bless her heart, wasn't letting it slide. Oh, Brandon's been helping out? She asked, looking genuinely interested. That's so sweet of him. What's he been doing, Anna? That's when I pulled out the ring. Funny thing, I said, holding it up so everyone could see. Anna, didn't you say you lost this weeks ago? While gardening, wasn't it? Mark put his wine glass down with a loud clink. Susan's eyes darted to Anna, her brow furrowing. Brandon, who had been slouching on the couch, suddenly looked like he wanted to melt into it. And Anna? She stared at me like a deer caught in the headlights. I don't know how it ended up there, she stammered, her voice barely audible. Maybe it fell. Maybe Brandon found it somewhere. I cut her off. In his car, Anna? Really? The silence that followed was suffocating. Brandon's face was beet red, and his hand twitched like he wanted to bolt, but didn't know where to go. Susan looked at her son, then at Anna, and I saw the exact moment the dots connected in her head. Anna, Susan said slowly, her voice trembling. What is he talking about? Why was your ring in Brandon's car? Anna opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her hands flew to her face like that would somehow shield her from what was happening. Mark, meanwhile, was staring daggers at his son. Brandon, he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. Explain. Now. I didn't mean for it to happen. Brandon blurted, his voice cracking. I swear, it wasn't supposed to. That was all I needed to hear. I stood up slowly, placing the ring carefully on the table. My voice was steady, even as my insides churned. I think that says it all, doesn't it? Anna's been having an affair with your son, my wife, and your kid. Susan let out this strangled gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Mark looked like he was about to punch a hole through the wall. Brandon's face crumpled, and Anna... Well, Anna just sobbed, her words incoherent as she tried to explain herself. But there was nothing to explain, nothing to justify. The truth was laid bare, and it was ugly. I didn't stay for the aftermath. What was the point? I grabbed my coat, looked at Anna one last time, this broken, pathetic version of the woman I thought I knew, and walked out the door. I didn't care how the Carters dealt with it. I didn't care what Anna said to them after I left. All I cared about was that the truth was out, and it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. As I drove home, the weight on my chest started to lift. Sure, my life was in pieces, and I had no idea what came next, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel trapped. I didn't feel like I was suffocating under the lies. Anna had destroyed our marriage, and in doing so, she destroyed herself. Now, all that was left for me to do was move forward and let her deal with the wreckage she'd left behind. The drive home that night was eerily quiet. No music, no calls, just the hum of the engine and my thoughts spiraling like a tornado. I replayed the scene over and over. The ring, Anna's tear-streaked face, Brandon's stammered excuses. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't cathartic. It was just empty. By the time I walked into the house, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me feeling like a hollowed-out shell. I dropped my coat on the floor and poured myself a drink, something stronger than the wine I'd barely touched at dinner. The bourbon burned going down, but it didn't numb the ache in my chest. Nothing would, not yet. Anna came home hours later, her footsteps hesitant as she stepped inside. I didn't look up from the couch where I was slouched, nursing my drink and staring blankly at the TV. She hovered in the doorway like a guilty child waiting to be scolded, her breaths uneven, her face blotchy from crying. "Ryan," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" I laughed bitterly, the sound cold and sharp. "Now you want to talk? You've been lying to me for months, Anna. What could you possibly say that I haven't already heard?" She flinched, but I didn't care. She deserved every ounce of the fury simmering in my chest. She walked slowly into the living room and sat on the edge of the armchair, wringing her hands like she was about to give a confession. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. I was lonely, Ryan. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in work. I didn't feel like you even saw me anymore." I slammed my glass onto the coffee table, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me," I snapped. "Lonely? That's your excuse? You slept with a teenager, Anna, a kid we've known since he was in middle school. Do you even realize how disgusting that is?" Her sobs started again, loud and messy, but I wasn't moved. I was too angry, too hurt to care about her tears. "You didn't just cheat on me," I continued, my voice low but venomous. "You betrayed our friends. You destroyed their trust, their family. Do you even understand what you've done?" "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Too late for that," I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. "You don't get to sorry your way out of this." I left her sitting there, her sobs echoing down the hallway as I walked out the door. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out, to put distance between myself and the mess she created. I ended up at a park, sitting on a cold bench under the streetlights, staring at the stars that seemed so far out of reach. It hit me then, my life would never be the same. The woman I thought I knew, the life we'd built together, it was all a lie. And yet, as painful as that realization was, there was also a strange sense of relief. The worst had happened. The truth was out. Now I could start picking up the pieces and figuring out what came next. But as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, I knew the fallout wasn't over. Anna's actions had sent shockwaves through our lives, through the Carters' lives, and the repercussions were only just beginning. The storm wasn't done with us yet. By the next morning, the ripples of Anna's betrayal had already started to spread. My phone buzzed constantly. Calls from friends, texts from people who'd been at the Carters' dinner party, even a few from Mark and Susan themselves. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to face the outside world yet. When I finally did glance at my phone, It was worse than I imagined. Word had gotten out, and the gossip mill in our tight-knit community was running at full speed. People were speculating about Anna, about Brandon, about how long this had been going on. It felt like every person I'd ever met suddenly had an opinion about my marriage. I stayed home that day, pretending to work while my mind reeled. Anna, to her credit, didn't try to talk to me again. She spent most of the day in the guest room, which I assumed was her attempt to give me space, or maybe to avoid my rage. Either way, it was better this way. I couldn't look at her without feeling a surge of anger and disgust. By mid-afternoon, I got a text from Susan. Just 2 words, "We need to talk." Part of me didn't want to respond. I didn't want to revisit the disaster that had unfolded the night before. But I owed her that much. She and Mark had been caught in the crossfire of Anna's selfishness, and they deserved answers. When I arrived at the Carter's house, Susan answered the door with a strained smile. She looked like she hadn't slept. Mark was sitting in the living room, his expression grim, a glass of whiskey in his hand, even though it was barely 4 p.m. "Thanks for coming," Susan said softly, leading me inside. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension in the room was suffocating. Brandon wasn't anywhere in sight, and I didn't ask where he was. I had no desire to see him. Susan gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, my arms crossed. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Mark spoke first, his tone clipped. "Brandon told us everything this morning. He admitted to the affair." I nodded slowly, the confirmation hitting harder than I expected. I'd already known, of course, but hearing it out loud, hearing them say it, made it feel even more real. Susan's voice broke as she added, "We're so sorry, Ryan. We had no idea. If we'd known, we would have stopped it." Her tears started to fall, and for the first time, I felt a pang of sympathy for them. They were victims too, blindsided by the same betrayal that had shattered my life. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "What are you going to do?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Brandon's leaving town. We're sending him to live with his aunt for the rest of the school year. And as for Anna," he hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "We filed a report with the school board." My stomach churned. A report. Of course, it was the right thing to do. Anna's actions were beyond unacceptable. But the thought of her facing a formal investigation, of her name being dragged through even more mud, made the situation feel even messier. Susan spoke up, her voice trembling. "We don't want to escalate things, Ryan, but she's a teacher. This isn't just about what happened between you two. She abused her position, and there have to be consequences." I nodded again, my throat tight. "I get it," I said, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "Do what you need to do." When I left their house, I felt heavier than when I'd arrived. The Carters were doing what they thought was right, but their actions would have consequences for me too. The scandal wasn't just Anna's anymore. It was mine. My name would be dragged through the mud alongside hers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. By the time I got home, I was drained. Anna was in the kitchen, her face blotchy from crying, but I ignored her as I walked past. She didn't call out to me, didn't try to stop me, and I was grateful for that. I couldn't stomach another conversation with her right now. I shut the door to the bedroom, the one that was now mine alone, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The storm was far from over, and I had no idea how I was going to weather it. All I knew was that I had to, because Anna had burned everything down, and now it was up to me to rebuild. I thought the worst of it was over. I thought Brandon would quietly leave for his aunt's house, lick his wounds, and disappear from our lives. But I was wrong, so wrong. What happened next made me realize just how deep Anna's betrayal went and how unhinged Brandon had become. 2 days after I confronted Anna, Susan called me, her voice trembling with frustration and exhaustion. Brandon wasn't leaving. He'd flat out refused to pack his bags, defying his parents in a way that seemed almost theatrical. Susan explained he had become obsessed, convinced that Anna loved him and that their relationship was meant to be. I sat there, gripping the phone, trying to wrap my head around what she was saying. Brandon, this kid I'd known for years, wasn't just some naive teenager who'd been manipulated. No, he believed this was real, that they were real. Worse, Susan confided, Brandon claimed Anna had told him she loved him too. I didn't want to believe it, but it made too much sense. Of course, Anna had said those words. Of course, she had fed him fantasies while feeding me lies. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete dismantling of every moral boundary. And then Susan dropped the final bombshell. Brandon had been sneaking out, likely to try and see Anna. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed every interaction, every sign I'd missed, every moment Anna had walked through the door with that faint glow that I now knew wasn't from work or stress. It was from him. And now this boy, who was supposed to be shipped off to his aunt's, was openly defying his family, convinced that he was Anna's savior. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of banging on the front door. At first, I thought it was the mailman or a delivery, but the banging didn't stop. Then came the shouting. My heart sank as I pulled myself out of bed, dreading what I already knew was happening. When I opened the door, there he was. Brandon stood there, flushed, his chest heaving like he'd run all the way to my house. His fists were clenched at his sides, and his eyes burned with a strange mix of determination and desperation. He wanted to see Anna. He wanted to talk to her, to tell her he wouldn't leave, that they could be together no matter what anyone else thought. I didn't need him to say it. Everything about his posture screamed his delusional resolve. He looked at me like I was the obstacle in his grand romantic narrative. And that's when I realized just how deep this mess had gone. Anna hadn't just had an affair with him. She had convinced him that their relationship was real, valid, and worth destroying everything for. She had planted this insanity in his head, built a version of herself in his mind that was so far removed from reality it made him willing to defy his parents, ruin his reputation, and come pounding on my door like some knight in shining armor. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me to block him from coming in. He stared me down, his jaw set, his body trembling. It hit me that, as much as I despised him, he was just a kid, a stupid, reckless kid, trying to play the hero in a story he didn't even realize was a tragedy. He shouted something, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to realize how ridiculous he looked. Eventually, he ran out of steam. He turned and walked away, shoulders slumped but still radiating that misplaced determination. It was pathetic. When I went back inside, Anna was waiting for me. She must have heard everything because her face was pale, her hands trembling. She looked like a guilty child caught red-handed. I didn't say anything to her. What was there to say? This was her mess. She'd nurtured this boy's delusions, fed him lies, and now she was reaping the consequences. The rest of the day passed in silence. I avoided her like the plague, holing up in the bedroom while she stayed in the guest room. My thoughts churned relentlessly, cycling through anger, disgust, and disbelief. Brandon was a symptom, but Anna was the disease. She'd torn apart 2 families, destroyed a marriage, and turned a naive teenager into a lovesick fool. And as much as I wanted to be done with her, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Brandon wasn't giving up, and Anna wasn't strong enough or moral enough to stop him. The storm wasn't just lingering. It was gathering strength. And I had no idea how much worse it would get. When everything first came crashing down, revenge was all I could think about. I wanted Anna to feel every ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me, to suffer the same humiliation, the same betrayal, the same searing anger that had torn me apart. I fantasized about destroying her the way she had destroyed us, about taking her down in ways she couldn't even imagine. But life has a way of meting out its own punishment. The fallout came faster than I expected. The Carters didn't stay quiet for long. How could they? Brandon's obsession had pushed them into a corner, forcing them to take action. A formal complaint was filed with the school board, and within days, Anna's career was over. Fired. Blacklisted. Her reputation as an educator, the thing she'd worked so hard to build, was left in ashes. Word spread like wildfire through our small community. Friends, colleagues, even casual acquaintances turned their backs on her. She became a pariah overnight, whispered about in grocery store aisles, and ignored at neighborhood gatherings. The same people who used to greet her with warmth now crossed the street to avoid her. And Brandon? He was sent away, just as Susan and Mark had planned. His parents couldn't bear to keep him in town, not with the scandal following him everywhere he went. It was over for him, too, though I had no sympathy. He'd been a willing participant in this mess, regardless of his age. At first, I thought her downfall would bring me peace. I wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated. But watching her crumble didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it just felt hollow. She stayed in the guest room, her once vibrant personality dulled to a shadow of itself. She barely ate, barely spoke, barely existed. The woman who had betrayed me so thoroughly now looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of what we used to have. And as much as I hated her, as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I couldn't help but feel sad. Not for her, for what we had lost. One night, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her hands. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I stood there for a moment, watching her, waiting for the anger to rise again. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a strange pang of something I hadn't expected: closure. "I'm leaving," I said finally, breaking the silence. My voice was calm, steady. She looked up at me then, her eyes hollow. "Ryan, please, we can fix this." "I can." "No, Anna, we can't." Her words fell away, and for a moment, it looked like she might argue. But then her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. I packed my things over the next few days, leaving her with the house, the furniture, and whatever remnants of our life she wanted to cling to. I didn't care about the material things anymore. All I wanted was to be free of her, of the weight of her betrayal. Walking out that door was one of the hardest things I've ever done, not because I still loved her, I didn't, but because it was the final acknowledgement that our life together, the one we had spent years building, was gone. And yet, as I drove away, I felt lighter. For the first time in months, I could breathe. They say time heals all wounds, and maybe that's true. I don't think I'll ever forget what she did, or how it felt to have my world ripped apart. But I've learned to let go of the anger, the bitterness, the need for revenge. Because holding on to those things doesn't hurt her. It only hurts me. Anna destroyed herself. She lost her career, her friends, her reputation. She's paying for her choices every single day. I don't need to add to that. My revenge, in the end, was walking away, leaving her to the life she chose, the consequences she couldn't escape. And now, finally, I can start again,